this.
Flip it on and then the sound will be good.
Okay.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming, for joining us. We're opening up this class because we want to invite people in the community and people that are interested in learning Chassidic to be part of the Mayanot family and to join us on this very special and unique journey of Tanya in 4 parts. We have an expert Torah teacher and educator at Mayanot who's able to literally condense the Tanya into 4 different sections, which is an extremely big feat. We're very honored to have him, and we're very happy you're all here. And we want to introduce you to Mayanot, the people that are unfamiliar, and just say welcome. And we're very happy that you're here. And we're gonna start, I think, in just about now.
Okay. Okay, so condensing the Tanya into 4 classes is not a simple matter. In general, the Tanya is a very condensed work. So as the sign said, that each class is going to be focused on one theme. And roughly speaking, we're going to be going in the order. Now, before we get into the actual topic of the class, it's important to talk a little bit about the order of the Tanya. Traditionally, most works of Chassidus, going back from the original collections of teachings of Baal Shem Tov until the very present day, generally do not follow any sort of ordered structure. They're generally collections of teaching arranged based on the weekly Torah reading or thematically arranged based on what holiday it is. The Tanya, I'm not going to say it's the only book like this, but I do believe it's the first Chassidic book like this, where the book is arranged in a logical order, where chapter 1 is meant to be studied before chapter 2, chapter 2 is meant to be studied before chapter 3, and there's a system to it. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to try and preserve the order. Okay? And that also helps us understand a little bit about the goal of the Tanya. The Tanya is meant to be viewed as a system for how one should approach life. And like any system, the more one embraces the system's totality, the more effective it will be. And the more one takes it piecemeal, the more difficult it is. Right? In other words, if you think of a very simple analogy, you have a car. If you have the whole car, the engine, the brakes, the steering wheel, right, it's going to work. But if you take only a few parts of the car and try to get it to work, and you might get the right parts, you might get an engine and a gas pedal and a steering wheel, hopefully some brakes. But if you only take, for instance, the doors, you're not getting anywhere. So it's very important to understand that the Tanya is presenting a holistic system, but at the same time it's a multifaceted system, meaning that within that there are certain subsections and subgenres that are applicable to different types of people at different stages of their life. We're obviously not going to be able to get into all of that nuance and complexity. We're going to focus on kind of the overarching structure and ideas. And the goal here ultimately is to understand that this is not meant to be theoretical knowledge, but knowledge that's supposed to reframe how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis. Now, the Tanya is set up around a single verse in the Torah. In other words, the first section of the Tanya, which is what we're going to be discussing in these classes, is all aimed to explain a single verse. And that verse is, I'm going to say it in Hebrew, and then I'll translate it, and then a little bit about why that verse needs an explanation. The verse is, Ki karev elecha hadavar ma'od, v'fichu levav chalasayse, which means, rather, this thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. Now, the context of this verse is the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, the end of Moses' life, and he is telling the Jewish people that this thing, which will come in a second what this thing is, it's not beyond them, it's not distant from them, it's not on the other side of the ocean, they would have to send someone to go get it for them. It's not in heavens, they would have to send someone to heavens. Rather, this is something that is close to them. So what is this thing? And the interpretation that the Tanya is working on is this thing refers to the totality of Torah mitzvahs, the totality of Judaism. That everything that God gave us as to how we're supposed to live our lives in Torah, that is not something that is distant from us, remote from us, not something we need somebody else to bring to us. That is something that is close. And the meaning here of close is not easy. Close means that we can get there using our own efforts. Okay? The context, right, is that it's not on the other side of the ocean, because if it was, we need to send someone else to get it for us. It's not in heaven, we need to send someone up to heaven to get it for us. Rather, close means it is within our jurisdiction, it's in our domain. It's up to us. As we all know from many endeavors in our life, just because something is up to us, just because something is in our control, doesn't mean that it comes easy. It doesn't mean that we don't need to practice. It doesn't mean that we don't need to train. It doesn't mean that we don't need education. But at the end of the day, we can carry that responsibility if it's something that's truly given over to us. And so this idea is that Judaism is ultimately given over to each individual Jew, and they can do it. That's the meaning of this verse. Now, why do you need an entire book to explain that? Because the verse says that this is close, karev, beficha, in your mouth, u'belavavcha, and in your heart, lasayse, to do it. Now, part of Judaism is verbal, is oral. We make blessings, recite the Shema, we say our prayers. We also have prohibitions regarding what we say. We're not allowed to slander people, we're not allowed to speak ill of people, we're not allowed to blaspheme, and there's all sorts of things that we're obligated and prohibited from doing with our speech. And obviously, there's all sorts of actions the Torah requires us to take and prohibits us from doing. Right? And anybody who's a functional adult, like anyone who's gone through puberty and is mentally competent, it can be expected to control their behavior, it can be expected to control what they say, and in fact, when they don't, we as a society, even not religiously, hold people responsible for those things. Obviously, we don't do that for children, and when someone's suffering from certain types of mental difficulties, we understand that. But as a general rule, that's what being a functional human being is. The difficulty with this verse is that the verse says, "U'belavavcha," in your heart. And what that means, straightforward, is whether or not I love God is in my control. Whether or not I fear God, have awe for God, respect for God, trust God, have faith in God is under my control. And that is not intuitively obvious that I can just decide today I don't have love for God, especially when I'm going to lose myself. It also means that things which God does not approve of in the heart, I have control over as well. That means I can just have control over whether or not I feel resentment towards God. I have control over whether or not I feel hatred toward another Jew, toward jealousy, right? And again, when we think about those things, it is not intuitively obvious that those are in our jurisdiction, those are under our control, the same way our physical actions and our speeches. And yet the Torah does say it is close to you in the singular, and it includes the heart. And so the Alter Rebbe's entire book of the Tanya, the first section anyway, the primary part of the book, is dedicated to explaining that verse, drawing on not just the general teachings of Torah, but more specifically insights that are found in Chassidus. So that is the context. Now for today, we are going to focus on the first 25 chapters. So the book is 53 chapters long, and today we're going to cover 25 of those chapters. So if I were to do this, we have, I think, as of right now, 50 minutes. So if I do 2 minutes a chapter, then we'll be good, right? We're not doing 2 minutes a chapter, because some chapters contain things that are much more fundamental and all-encompassing, and some chapters get more focused on a particular issue that may not be read with every person at every point in time. So we're going to focus on the general themes that come out of these 25 chapters, so we have kind of a bird's eye view and a sense of its relevance rather than getting caught up in any particular details. Which obviously means this is going to be somewhat unsatisfying because every issue needs to be further explained and elaborated, which we don't have the time to do, but I'm encouraged to learn more. Okay. So the first idea that we need to come to understand, and today's topic is the soul, is what we mean by a soul, and then arguably one of the key innovative teachings of the Tanya is that a Jew has two souls. Now, what is meant by soul is a very precise thing. The soul is the thing that someone possesses that makes them who and what they are. So, to make this very simple, the idea is that a dog has a soul. And the dog's soul makes the dog be a dog. A cat has a soul. And the soul of the cat is what makes the cat be a cat. The soul is not a physical thing. But the soul is the thing that guides the physical thing to embody, to instantiate, to give physical reality to that kind of a thing. This is why, for instance, in a living being, when the soul departs, the body stops being that thing, right? If the soul of the dog were to leave the dog, that piece of the physical world would stop instantiating, embodying what it is to be a dog. Which means, if you think about this idea, you really only should have one soul, because you're either a dog or you're a cat, you're a dolphin or you're an elephant. Right? You're not two things. And so the idea that there are two souls is not meant to be easily understood, because to say there's two souls, that means there's actually two competing definitions for who and what every Jew is. This is very different than the classic idea we find in the Talmud, that we have a Yetzer Tov and a Yetzer Hara, a good and evil inclination. A good and evil inclination means that there is something that is driving us to do good things, something driving us to do bad things. And whether we think of that as psychological urges or angels enticing us, the point is, one single person who ultimately wants what's good for them can be convinced that good things are good for them, that would be the Yetzer Tov, or it can be convinced that bad things are good for them, unfortunately, and that would be the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. But at the core, there's just one person trying to live their life. The idea of two souls is that there's actually two separate kinds of beings competing over the same spot of the physical world. Later on, the Alter compares this to like two kings warring over a small city. Right? The kings are separate people with separate agendas, and they both want to reign over the city. So the human body is the city, and these souls are like the kings. And this does not match perfectly with our own self-experience, because we don't feel like we're two different people. We maybe feel like I want different things. And so one of the difficulties with Tanya and Chassidus in general is that it is giving us language for a deeper part of ourselves than we're necessarily immediately familiar with, and sometimes that can sound strange. So you'll find expressions like the godly soul explaining something to the animal soul, the godly soul suppressing the animal soul fighting back, as if there's like these two beings inside of us, and that is in fact the idea. Now, we need to give a short definition for what we mean by each soul. One soul, as I've already mentioned, is called the godly soul, and one soul is called the animal soul. The animal soul is called the animal soul because it's an animal. What is the defining characteristic of an animal? So Chassidus understands the defining characteristic of an animal is that it is concerned with its own well-being. An animal will do whatever it can to make sure, to the best of its ability, that its well-being is being secured, being safeguarded, being enhanced. Now, some beings are solitary beings. Some beings are social beings. And if you're a social being, your sense of your own well-being is limited to your individual self. It includes your family. It includes your community. Okay? So if somebody is willing to give up their life to save their family, that doesn't necessarily make them not an animal, because their sense of their own well-being goes beyond their own individual organism and includes the family unit. Anything that is motivated for the preservation and flourishing of myself, whether that's a narrow sense of myself, like a narcissistic person, or it's a broad sense of myself, right, like someone who's fighting for their country, at the core is this animal drive to pursue one's sense of well-being to the best that they can. And that's what the animal soul is. Now, obviously different kinds of animals. Chimpanzees are one kind of animal, and dolphins are one kind of animal, and humans are a specific kind of animal. We're a very complex, deep animal. For instance, one of our needs that we have as human animals is we need to feel that we're doing something meaningful. We need to feel belonging. We need to feel purpose. That's part of our well-being. So the animal soul is not some sort of debased creature that only wants to do bad things. The animal soul, as it matures, wants a meaningful life, a life of connection, a life of relationships, a life of purpose. It also wants to sit on the couch with potato chips, because sometimes it feels like that's because well-being is a little bit more tired and mature. In contrast to all that, you have the godly soul. The godly soul is godly. Now, the expression that's used in Tanya to introduce the godly soul is that it is a chelik elokah mimal mamish. Literally, that translates is a literal piece of God. Now, this is not a philosophy class. We're not going to go into all the philosophy, but it is important to be aware that this idea is not an innovation of the time. This idea exists in Kabbalah, precedes the time. And what the Alter is doing is he's trying to take this idea from Kabbalah and make it a little bit more relevant. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to unpack what that phrase means in a way that's not so philosophical, but is more relevant. The term chelek, or a piece, in this context, it means like a copy. So the analogy that's used is like you have a parent and a child. The child is a little copy of the parent. The parent's a person. Then they copy their own humanity, and then you're a child. or the way a spark is a little copy of a piece of the fire, like a bonfire, and then a spark comes out of it, it's a little bit of fire in its own right. So the idea of a piece here means you have the original, and then you have a copy. And the copy has all the same essential characteristics as the original, but it came from the original. And by the way, because it's a copy, it has its own independence, right? If you have a fire and a spark comes out, and you put out the original bonfire, the spark could still kindle a fire in its own right. God forbid a parent dies, the child can live on. Right? Because being a copy of something means you're something in your own right. Being a copy of someone means you're also someone in your own right. And so the idea is that there is a quality of divine awareness, the way God makes his presence felt in the most profound way, and God makes a little copy of that kind of an energy, and that's what the godly soul is. So the godly soul is a being that is aware of God, and is aware of God in the most intimate way possible, in a way that can be only compared to the way God is aware of himself. So we say, just like God is aware of himself, God copies that kind of an awareness and gives it a separate being, gives it a separate sense of self, and that's what the godly soul is. Which means, in essence, the godly soul doesn't really have the same sense of I, the same sense of self, the same sense of individuality that we're familiar with. There's nothing like a godly soul in the physical world. And everything about the godly soul, therefore, is always oriented towards God. So, for instance, if you want the godly soul to understand something, it can only understand something if what you're explaining to it is grounded in God and helps make God seem more reasonable. So your godly soul cannot understand sports unless the sports are used as an analogy to help make God make more sense to you. Your godly soul cannot understand halacha, Jewish law, because Jewish law does not actually talk about God. Jewish law talks about how you cook, how you clean on Shabbos, who you can marry. Right? It doesn't talk directly about God. So the godly soul doesn't understand halacha, Jewish law. Now, if you can convince it that this is somehow the will of God, to know how you're allowed to make tea on Shabbos or whatever, it can be cajoled into trying to figure that stuff out. The godly soul's entire psyche is always centered and oriented directly towards God. So it would even be incorrect to say that the godly soul wants to have a relationship with God. Why? Because when you have a relationship with someone else, right? There's a sense of who I am and who you are and how we fit together. The godly soul wants to have the sense of God as clear and as absolute as God has it for himself. And so the godly soul is otherworldly. The godly soul is not what makes us good people. The godly soul is something beyond being a person. And what we need to understand is, why does the Alter Rebbe make this the foundational concept that we have in addition to the animal soul, which again is what makes us human beings and even gives us our desire for meaning and purpose? Why does the godly soul also have relevance? And there are going to be two answers to that question. The first answer is that the godly soul gives us the ability to do something. And when we understand what that ability is, we'll have the answer to our question, right? Our question was, how can we say that it's within our control whether we genuinely love Hashem, genuinely feel a desire to be close to God, genuinely feel devotion to Him, genuinely trust Him? And the reason why that's a question is not simply because emotions are difficult things to control. It's because in order to have an emotional connection with something, that thing has to be real to you. Little children cannot feel good because the economy is doing well, nor can they feel bad when the economy is doing poorly, because the economy isn't real to them. But if their parent doesn't take them on a trip that they promised, then they can get upset, because that is real to them. So if I love somebody, I have to have a sense that somebody is real to me. If I'm afraid of something, I have to have a sense that thing is real to me. Now here's the thing. If we talk about God in terms of the role that He plays in our life, and that's why I feel feelings towards God, then I'm not really feeling feelings towards God Himself. What I'm feeling feelings towards is the role that He plays in my life. If I feel gratitude because God gave me food, then I really feel gratitude towards the food. It happens to be God's one who gave it to me. But if it turned out, let's go back to the times of idolatry, if I was convinced that, say, the idol Baal was the one who gave me the food, then that feeling would transfer immediately over to the idol. It's not God specific. I just feel gratitude whoever I'm currently convinced gave me the food. Whoever I'm currently convinced gives me meaning. And I don't see that that's a bad thing, right? But think about being on the receiving end of that for a moment. Think about someone expressing their love for you, their gratitude towards you, and then it turns out that what they feel love and gratitude has nothing to do with you specifically. It just happens to be you're the one who did the thing. It's not a bad thing, but it doesn't feel very close. It doesn't feel very intimate. However, the godly soul is capable of knowing God, right? That's the core of it, is this awareness of God as intimately as God is aware of himself. So if we possess somewhere deep buried in our psyche a godly soul, that means we have the power, we have the ability to know God in that way. And so the godly soul's ability to know God is what gives us the ability to develop those types of feelings. Okay? To use an analogy, somebody who has a sense of humor can appreciate a joke, but they have to have their own sense of humor. Somebody who has a mathematical sense can understand a mathematical argument, but they have to have their own mathematical sense. If I want to love God, I need to have a godly sense. Otherwise, I don't recognize God as God. I recognize God as the provider of safety, the provider of food, the provider of my human needs. And then what I'm loving is the provider of my human needs. But who and what God is on his own terms, I am unaware of. Having a godly soul means I have the ability to know God in that way. Does that mean that it comes automatically? Does that mean it comes easily? No. Now, so what's happening here is that there's a conflict between the godly soul and the animal soul. The animal soul wants a person to live their life in a way that will enhance their life the best possible way. Sometimes that's very crass and debased when the person is feeling immature, and sometimes that's very profound and lofty when the person is more developed. But it's all about myself, and even the broad sense of myself, me, my family, my community, my country. The godly soul wants the human life to reveal and express God's truth. If I were to be cynical, the godly soul is trying to hijack the person for godly ends. And the animal soul, which is what makes us a person, is not really keen on this. We want to live our own lives. And so there's this fundamental conflict. What am I? Am I a person with this annoying godly sense that's kind of giving me Jewish guilt? Or am I a godly being manifesting what God truly is in the form of a human being living on planet Earth? Those are two very senses of who I am. And that's really the fundamental conflict. It's not a conflict of whether I sin or don't sin, whether I'm a good person or a bad person. It's a much more profound conflict. It's a much more mystical conflict. And what the author is saying is that conflict exists deep in the recesses of our psyche, whether aware of it or not at all times. And so now the question is, how does that conflict play out, and how can we do something constructive to actually lead this to some level of resolution that's positive? And that's really what the first 25 chapters are going to be about. I said there were two answers, and we'll get to the second answer a little bit later. So what the Alter Rebbe does is he says, well, in order to understand all of that, what we need to do is we understand that the soul operates, and by the soul I mean both the godly soul and the animal soul, operate on two basic levels. And we need to keep these levels separate. Not that they have no relationship to each other, but confusing them is part of what creates our inability to make progress on this issue. Now, he labels these two levels in Hebrew the koiches, the powers or the faculties, and the other level he calls the levushim, or the garments. What are the powers? The powers are the way the soul, whether it's the godly soul or the animal soul, has a relationship with anything. A relationship is something that you are part of. You experience yourself in relationship to other things. So, love would be a power of the soul. Fear would be a power of the soul. Knowledge would be a power of the soul. Understanding would be a power of the soul. Loyalty would be a power of the soul, because these are the way I relate to something. I understand certain things. I know certain things. I love certain things. I hate certain things. And we think about it, what really shapes a person are these types of experiences. Okay? So, there are ultimately, in general, 10. We're not going to go through each one in detail, but broadly speaking, the Alter Rebbe divides them into two. One is the way we relate to something in a more open and receptive way. So this is, for instance, when someone is talking, you're truly trying to understand them. when you recognize that something is beautiful because it really is beautiful, or you recognize something is ugly because it really is ugly. And the other way of relating to something is where it's about how you want to react to it. Do I want to get closer? Do I want to get further away? Do I feel that I have to do something because of this? Okay? So the first way, that more open way, is called seichel, poorly translated as intellect, because it's not only about how smart you are and how well you do in school. It's about how much you can recognize the truth of things for the way they are. And then the other one is called midas, poorly translated as emotions, which really means measures, which means the responses that we have. So, for instance, the fact that we think that money is valuable goes in the first category. That's the seichel. We say, oh, money is a valuable thing. And because of that, when I make money, I feel happy. And when I lose money, I feel sad. That would go in the second category. Okay? Now, let's talk about the godly soul and the animal soul. And they're both in shul in the synagogue, and they're both praying. How can I tell if it's the godly soul praying or the animal soul praying? So praying means beseeching God for your needs. Well, the godly soul and the animal soul, if the animal soul is wise enough, it also prays to God. God runs the world. And the more you're beseeching God for your needs, the more you feel the lack. So there's the value of the thing you lack, that's why it bothers you, and there's the sense of sadness, the sense of loss, the sense of hope that goes into the request, right? You're missing the thing, you prefer to have it, you're hoping that the prayer will be successful. And let's take the prayer to be very intense. So sometimes when a person's praying very intensely, they may cry, right? There may be like, you really feel the emotion in a very deep way. What does the animal soul pray for? Money. Health. What does the godly soul pray for?
Closeness.
The godly soul prays for closeness to God. The godly soul prays for God's truth and light be revealed to the world. The godly soul prays that the person who's praying shouldn't be so obsessed with their morning. The godly soul prays for a sense of God, and the animal soul prays what the human being thinks that they need. Now, when you start to think about that, you can realize that the godly soul is not so distant and far from us, but it gets mixed in with the animal soul. And that level, the level of the koiches, is a big mess. Because I know things with the powers of my godly soul, I know things with the powers of my animal soul, I feel things with the powers of my godly soul, I feel things with the powers of my animal soul, and this is like the traditional Jewish food challenge, where everything is in it, but nothing has a well set place, and so it becomes a giant mush. Then the other level is called the levushim, the garments. And the garments are basically those things that the soul can do based on what it knows and feels. And we've grouped those into three general categories. There's thoughts. And by thoughts here, so we're clear, by thoughts I mean the pictures and words in our head. Not the feelings, the pictures and words in our head. There's speech, which are the words that we say. And then there are actions, which are the things we choose to do with our body. Everything from writing, to walking, to playing an instrument. Now, each soul has its own set of garments. Each soul has its own way of taking those ways of behaving, whether it's thought, speech, or action, and using it to make its presence felt. The godly soul has a very limited set of garments. The godly soul's garments are any thoughts, any words, or any actions which are themselves godly. Now what makes those things godly? God has a desire for us to do those things. We call those things Torah and mitzvahs. Everything else, from brushing your teeth to bowing down to an idol, would not be the garments of the godly soul. And I say, what's bad about brushing your teeth? The answer is nothing's bad about brushing your teeth, but what is the value of brushing one's teeth? It's for themselves, that they have teeth that they can use. And therefore it's not oriented. The action is not a divine action. I put on tefillin every day, except on Shabbos. The only reason I put black boxes on my head and arm is because God thinks it's an important thing to do. As a human being, it's hard to think of a good reason why you should do that. And even mitzvahs where we do have good reasons for it, What makes it a mitzvah is not the reasons we understand, but the fact that God says that that's a valuable thing to do. So the Torah and mitzvahs are the godly garments, and everything else are not the godly garments. And there, it's actually a little more black and white, because I can just check, is this a godly action or not a godly action? Does the Torah command me to do this, or does it not command me to do this? Are these godly words, are they not godly words? Right? Are these godly thoughts or not godly thoughts? Now, granted, if you're ignorant of the Torah, you're ignorant of those parameters, then you can't tell, but it's a matter simple of getting you informed, right? So you can look up the laws of, say, what you're allowed to do, not allowed to do on Shabbos, and what actions are required, not required on Shabbos, then you'll know what are the godly actions. You can learn what kinds of things God wants us to say. You can learn what kind of things God wants us to think. Okay? And could there be some gray area, not 100% sure you make a judgment call? Yeah, but that's not what we're going to talk about. But so we can say the action, what is about this action? What is about these words? What is about these thoughts that make them, give them value? Is it because they further my human well-being? They further what I value as a person? Or is it because God sees them as valuable? Those are the two types of garments. And what the Eldrin points out is that mess that we find on the level of the powers is not such a mess on the level of the garments. And based on that, the Alter Rebbe divides all Jews into roughly 3 categories. Now, when you're dividing into these categories, this is not that God decrees on heaven which category it would go into. These are descriptive categories. Okay? In other words, you may be in one category, and you may later on be in a different category. The categories are as follows. I will describe them first and label them next. And then afterwards I'll tell you why I'm labeling them afterwards. The first category is where the godly soul has complete dominion of both levels, which means all of the person's powers, all of their inner experiences, their mind, their heart, what they know, what they feel, what they hope for, what they feel connected, all of that is all the godly soul. And the animal soul, for all intents and purposes, is rendered irrelevant. And what follows from that is all the person's garments, their thoughts, their speech, and their action is all going to be godly. They're going to say, wait a minute, how could that possibly be? I mean, the person still has to get up and go to work and things like that. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But that's one kind of person. In other words, the godly soul won the war, it conquered the city, and the animal soul, I don't know, it's hiding somewhere. That's one type of a person. The other type of a person is where the animal soul has won. Now, when we say the animal soul is one, we have to understand that that's not a perfect symmetry. Because is the animal soul anti-God in principle? No. The animal soul is anti-anything that compromises my sense of well-being. So the animal soul wins when the animal says, look, the godly soul can do a few mitzvahs here and there, as long as I find them meaningful. But when I don't find them meaningful, when I find them inconvenient, then we're not going to do them. So could you have a person who does the Torah and mitzvahs perfectly 99.9% of the time, but once in a while when they're not in the mood and they don't find it meaningful and inspiring, they say, hey, whatever, it's not, everything has its limits, and then they do something maybe not what God would approve of so much? Then what does that show? What's really in control of that person? Which soul? The animal soul. So the animal soul winning does not mean the person is a big sinner, doesn't mean they're an evil person. It means that the godly soul needs permission. It doesn't have that absolute clarity that it's seeking. And then you have in between. And in between works like this. The godly soul hasn't won. The animal soul hasn't won. But because the godly soul and the animal soul haven't won, they each play to their own strengths. The strength of the animal soul is in how we feel emotionally, that level called the midas. What we love, what we're afraid of, what we find interesting. It's much stronger in that arena. Like some people are better at playing chess and some people are better at playing soccer, right? So if you're a better chess player and you want to win, you say, let's play chess. So the animal soul says, you haven't won, I haven't won, but I'm stronger in this emotional realm, so let's focus on the emotions a lot. The godly soul, because God is true, so the godly soul is oriented towards truth. That's its strong point. Its strong point is a sense of clarity, a sense of objectivity. And so the animal soul, it says, let's not be too honest about it. Let's not be mature about things. Let's not be level-headed about things. That plays to its strength. But the godly soul is going to say we should actually be mature. We should be level-headed. And when that happens, it plays to its strengths. Now, for this we need to add one other detail. The nature of human beings is that human beings are rational creatures. What I mean by that is the degree to which something is clear to us in our mind as to how reality really is, our emotions naturally fall in line. In other words, if you're afraid of something, and you genuinely know that there's nothing to be afraid of, and you're not confident it's something mental illness, what happens to the fear? It subsides. Now, if it's not subsiding, maybe you're telling yourself you know there's nothing to be afraid of, but part of you still thinks there is something to be afraid of. Right? That could happen. Well, if that's the case, then the godly soul is at an automatic advantage, because the godly soul says, look, I'm in touch with reality, and this is the way reality is. The animal soul says, yeah, but I feel differently. And the godly soul says, okay, you can feel differently, it doesn't change reality. And because people are the way they are, that itself causes the feelings to subside in it. And so what ends up happening is if neither soul has defeated the other, a person will still experience the perspective and the emotions of the animal soul. But their worldview, their choices, their decision-making, in other words, how they act in the world, how they speak, and what thoughts they choose to entertain will all be in alignment with the godly soul. And this leads to a very interesting phenomenon, where on the outside, this person is to be perfectly righteous and godly, and their value system is perfectly righteous and godly, but inside, they've got a lot of skeletons in the closet that they can feel and deal with. But at the same time, it's not that they're really struggling to contain them, because they have a sense of what's ultimately real, what's ultimately true, what's ultimately important. That's the middle category. So to summarize, when the godly soul wins, all the animal soul's considerations are banished. When the animal soul wins, the godly soul needs permission, and if it doesn't get it, then the person will do ungodly things. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. And the middle category is nobody wins. So whoever is genuinely stronger plays to their strengths, and the result is the person knows what's right and wrong. They choose based on what they know. They live their values, but inside they can feel other parts of themselves pushing back. So those parts are contained, and not contained just using brute force and willpower, contained because they have a sense of how much those parts really matter, how much they don't. And this is something we know as people, as adults. We know that, for instance, I could be annoyed and say, okay, I'm annoyed, but it's not worth ruining my day over my annoyance, right? We all have that quality. And so that's just using that format and having the godly soul and the animal soul slip into their respective roles. Now, the Alter Rebbe calls the first category, where the godly soul wins, he calls that person a tzaddik, which literally means a righteous person. Why does he call that person a tzaddik? Well, because if you have a godly soul, what would be the correct thing? What would be the proper thing? What would be the just thing, given that there's a godly soul? So the godly soul should be the sole ruler of the human being. Be the one who's enacting everything as they will it. The one who brings a godly sense to every part of the psyche. That's what's proper. That's what's just. That's what's what it should be. Now, anyone who's had small children knows that children have a very strong sense of justice. They also live in la la land. Right? So they say it's not fair because is everything always the way it's supposed to be? No. So the tzaddik is like, that's the way it's supposed to be. Is that always the way it is? Is that even a realistic expectation? Not necessarily. The second category, the one where the animal soul wins, which sounds a little bit familiar to many of us, the Alter Rebbe calls that a rasha, a wicked person. Now, so wait a minute, that doesn't sound very nice. What should a wicked person do? Not what should we do to a wicked person. What should a wicked person do? Tshuva. They should repent. They should return. They should stop. So by telling the person that you're a wicked person, that can be a matter of condemnation. Or it can be a diagnosis. And saying, you may have decided to accept the situation. Once in a while I slip up. Once in a while I say, once in a while I'm not in the mood. Once in a while God takes a back seat to other interests. And you may think that that's okay. What the Alter Rebbe is saying is, no, don't sell yourself short. This is not an okay place to settle. To use a human analogy, if someone speaking to their friend says, I think I'm a pretty good parent. I only lock my kids in the bathroom like every other week and I only, don't give them dinner, every other month or something. what would the friend probably say? But that's, I mean, I think maybe you should speak to somebody. That doesn't sound like a normal standard, right? You know, like you should, that's not a proper way for a parent to behave to the child. You don't lock the kid in the bathroom, you don't deprive them of dinner, right? You have issues, you have to figure out how to deal with them. That's not the way to deal with it, right? We are notorious as human beings for coming up with justifications for why the way we're living is good enough. And what the author is saying is, okay, that may be where you're holding, but don't settle for that. And then he calls the category in between, creatively, in between, Bainani, which is kind of self-explanatory. So, you have the ideal, the tzaddik, you have the unacceptable, and again, unacceptable not on the point of condemnation, but acceptable that we should accept it for ourselves. We should strive to get past that, which is the Rasha. And then, well, I guess then that means that in the middle is not ideal, but at least acceptable. And that's how the Alter frames it. That we should strive to be a tzaddik. We should never accept if we are currently a Rasha. So what if it turns out that my godly soul has not succeeded in totally transforming who I am as a person? But I have managed to develop that clarity about God, that awareness of God that my godly soul provides for me. And that gives me the commitment, the devotion, the passion to do mitzvahs properly and to stop myself from sinning. Should I feel like I'm a failure because I haven't totally transformed myself? He says no. So you didn't get to the ideal. But if, on the other hand, I relegate my godly soul to secondary status and say, ultimately, my godly soul only can show up, only can play a role when it fits the animal soul's agenda, that's something I should never accept for myself. That doesn't mean it's easy, but that's something that we can do because, again, the soul is played to the human strengths. Ultimately, and this we know from adults, as adults, we expect people to have their head on their shoulders, be in touch with the reality, and make appropriate decisions. And living like that makes us proper channels for the strengths of the godly soul over the animal soul. And so the Alter Rebbe says like this, well, the way to deal with this is to spend time tapping into your godly soul's ability to become more aware of God, to genuinely get to know God, and feel that love, and feel that passion, and feel that commitment and devotion, and then live off of that sense of clarity. And before it fades, go back and strengthen that awareness again. And this is the classic cycle of the Bainani. The classic cycle of the Bainani is time dedicated to focusing entirely on becoming more aware of God, which is in the Chassidic tradition, what one does during prayer. And then, as one walks out of that experience with a sense of clarity, a sense of truth about who I am, who God is, what the nature of the world is, how important my godly actions are, then that clarity allows them to live in alignment with the godly soul, even though they don't feel exclusive to the godly soul. Now, over time that fades because we experience other things, and so before that fades too much, what does the person need to do? To dedicate more time to praying again. Which is why in the old classic tradition you have these images of some chassid spending hours and hours with his talus over his head, not even necessarily saying words, but deeply pondering the truth of God, the truth of the soul, what it's all about. Now, if that has to be a priority in a person's life. You don't become a doctor by doing it, as a hobby when you find it convenient. You don't get to know God in a way that brings you to deep senses of connection, devotion, and awe if you do it when it's convenient. You have to make that a priority in your life. And that's possible to achieve that because the godly soul gives us that power. Now, on the other hand, we still have to go to work. We still have to do the groceries. And so the Alter Rebbe says that as long as something is not prohibited, as long as God says you may not do this thing, if you are doing it in order to help facilitate the godly sense, in order to be able to pray, in order to be able to develop that awareness of God, or in order to be able to do the mitzvahs that you now desire to do, then your godly soul actually transforms those actions, those behaviors, those thoughts into godly things himself. So a person who loves God in this way, respects God in this way, feels devoted to God in this way, and goes to work because they know they can't get tzedakah unless they make money. They can't raise a family unless there's a roof over their heads, and so they need to go to work. And they do that with that kind of a motivation. Their going to work becomes a godly act. On the other hand, God forbid, the Alter Rebbe says, if a person takes something that is entirely permitted and does it in a way that is abandonment of God. It's a rejection of God. It's a hedonistic indulgence. Eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow. I don't really care. I just want to feel good in the moment. Even if it's kosher with all the hechsher in the world, at that moment, it separates a person from God. It harms the health of the godly soul in a way that is analogous to sin. Because it doesn't matter that you didn't break the rule. What matters is that person mentally, inside, is in a place of total estrangement from God. Which means, what the author is saying is, if you take your kid out for ice cream because your godly soul has gotten you to realize that God wants you to raise children in a way that they feel a sense of connection and belonging to their family, to the Jewish people, and they feel comfortable with their Jewish identity, and that doesn't happen in a family where there's strife. But you take your kids out for ice cream, and you really care about them, and you really care about their connection to God. And if you're in a child's world, ice cream is a big deal, and you give them ice cream, and they want you to have ice cream with them because it's more fun to have it with your father or your mother, and you're eating the ice cream. Then eating the ice cream has become godly. On the other hand, when you've had enough of the day, you don't want to speak to anybody, and you want everyone, including God Almighty, to just leave you alone, and so you sit with a pint of ice cream on the couch, the person is internally as estranged from God as if they were doing something that's actually technically forbidden. The consequences are not the same, but in terms of the effect on the relationship, it's very severe. And so what the Alter Rebbe is showing us now is that this idea of developing an awareness of God and developing feelings towards God is something that we have the power to do. It's something that we can then channel into our doing the Torah mitzvahs. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll achieve the ideal. The ideal is that our internal sense, our koiches, our powers, are entirely godly. Such a person would never be tempted to sin, doesn't find pleasure in anything that is ungodly, even if it's not forbidden. Such a person would look at doing something that is just a mundane human experience as empty and meaningless unless it somehow brought them to a closer sense of God or brought others to a closer sense of God. And that's an ideal we should strive for, but the Alter Rebbe says not everyone is capable of achieving it, and you need special divine assistance to achieve it. And if you look back in the verse did not promise that our heart is close to us in all respects. The verse says, Ki karev elecha davar ma'od, this thing is close to you, extremely close to you, beficha, in your mouth, u'levavcha, in your heart, la'asosei, to do it. So the Alter says it's close in the sense that we're talking about the emotions that motivate us to do the mitzvahs, that motivate us to think godly thoughts, to speak in godly ways, to do godly actions. But the level of our needs, the level of the emotions, the level of how we feel, that totally transforms us to be a transcendent, godly person, that it feels no attachment to anything unholy ever. That the Torah never promised is close to everybody. And so it doesn't mean that we're exempt from aspiring to it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't value it. It doesn't mean, but at the same time, we need to have a difference between what we aspire to and what we are expecting of ourselves. And so the Alter Rebbe's point here is, if I am still letting my animal soul dictate how close I feel to God and how important it is to me to live out His desires in this world, then I have to demand more of myself. Okay, and that's a process. Fine. But if I have achieved that, but I still don't feel completely holy, well, okay, maybe I'm not the ideal person. And that's okay. And later on, the Alter is going to address how do I deal with the feelings that come from realizing I'm not an ideal person. That's not for today's class. Now, I did tell you there was a second thing. The second reason why the godly soul is relevant. And the second reason why the godly soul is relevant is because the verse says, Ki karev elecha hadavar ma'od, that this matter is close to you. But it doesn't say close to you. It says karev ma'od, very close to you, extremely close to you. And so the Alter Rebbe concludes from that the closeness has to be something that is accessible to everybody. And spending a significant amount of time as a regular part of your schedule, pondering the greatness of God so you can truly get to know Him using those godly powers locked deep down inside yourself, is something that a person needs to be capable of. A person needs to have the mental maturity to do that. A person needs to have the time to do that. A person needs to have the spiritual sensitivity to do that. Not everybody has that at all times. And so Alter Rebbe says there must be another approach. And the other approach is that the godly soul already feels a love of God. The godly soul already feels a devotion to God. And that is buried there all along. And so rather than generating a new awareness of God, and therefore new feelings towards God, the other approach is that the person can come to terms with something that exists already inside of them. In other words, what the Alter is saying, instead of trying to develop a love of God, acknowledge that it already exists inside of you. Now, what does that look like? So the Alter says that essentially the reason why a Jew doesn't feel like they have this love of God is because the Jew isn't in touch with himself. He calls this the Ruach Shtus, the spirit of folly. What is the spirit of folly? The spirit of folly is the spiritual basis for the fact that we have the ability as people to lie to ourselves and believe our own lies. The fourth Chabad Rebbe, the Rebbe Marash, this works in Yiddish and it works in English, doesn't work in Hebrew. He says, the only person you can fool is yourself. And it's not impressive to fool a fool. It only works because of the double meaning for a fool. That's what the Ruach Shtus is. The Ruach Shtus is that we can fool ourselves when we believe our own lies. And the only solution for that is what? Is to be honest with yourself that you're lying to yourself. It's not, in other words, it's not a complicated thing. It requires just a lot of honesty, that's all. And so Alter says, look, if deep down you have a God who already loves God, and how much does it love God? It's the thing that motivates even a totally estranged Jew sometimes to give up their life rather than deny that they're a Jew, rather than deny the truth of Torah mitzvahs. It's the thing that gives even the most uneducated person a sense of simple faith in God. It's the thing that makes a person feel that Judaism feels right to them in a way they can't explain. It's something that peeks through in all sorts of ways. And the only reason it doesn't have a stronger effect is because we lie to ourselves as if it's not that big of a deal. That sense of belief and devotion and connection, we treat it as childish, we treat it as something insignificant. The second Chabad Rebbe once said that the problem is that we treat a spark as if it's just a spark, and we forget that a spark really can light an entire city on fire. So that little sense of belief, of interest, called sometimes the pintel yid, little Jewish spark, that's something that everybody has some sense of. And if instead of pushing it away or ignoring it or not taking it seriously, we turned our attention and say, what is that part of me really saying? What does that say about who I am? If push came to shove, what would that motivate me to do? And start to try to live with some integrity on the basis of that, we would unlock a level of devotion and a level of connection and a level of trust in God that's buried there all along. And that does not take hours and hours of contemplation. It doesn't take being a theologian and knowing the greatness of God. It's tapping into something more fundamental, similar to the way a child feels an innate love to their parents. They don't have to learn about their parents. They don't have to get to know their parents. That's already in. And Alter says, so the godly soul gives us two things. It gives us the ability to know God in an intimate way on his level, and therefore we can have this love of God, this fear of God, this devotion to him, this trust in him, that's genuinely directed at him. But even if we can't do that, the godly soul also gives us this strong sense of attachment, of an unbreakable bond that shows up in all these subtle ways, and sometimes very, very extreme ways. And if we were to start taking that part of ourselves seriously, start being honest with, if that part of me was a little bit more present, how would I behave? How would I feel? And start to live with integrity, we'll discover that part of ourselves authentically, and then we'll also be able to live the Beinoni life, even if we don't spend hours and hours contemplating God. But what it does require is a focus on inwardness. Nothing the Alter Rebbe says is effective if a person is just going to approach this in a superficial way, in a way that they're just going to go through the motions. Because you can't genuinely get to know something. I mean, think about this, whether it's academic study or getting to know a person. If you do not really invest yourself, you're never going to really come to a new awareness of things. If you're not going to insist on being honest with yourself, we slip into the pattern of lying to ourselves very, very easily. And I can make it look to other people who don't know me so well. I mean, people know me so well, that look, I'm doing all the mitzvahs, I'm really into this stuff. But ultimately, the path Alter is laying out is where a person has to be very, very clear. When I say that I'm Jew and I do Judaism, and that means something to me, where is that coming from? Is that coming from because I've put in the effort and the time and the commitment to unlock my godly power to know God and build this profound relationship because I know God in an intimate way? Or is it because I'm being honest with myself in a very deep way, in a very rigorous way, sometimes in a brutal way, as to what does this godly spark in me ask of me? What is it pushing me to do? What would happen if I didn't just shut it out? What would it tell me? And that's a practice. That's something that a person has to do consistently. And what happens over time when a person does that consistently? The character of who they are starts to change, and God becomes somebody that is very real to them because of the godly soul. And that has actually real life consequences. One of the real life consequences is that your whole relationship with Torah and mitzvahs changes completely. Because now Torah mitzvahs, instead of being something that the person is working on, Torah mitzvahs become, as King David says, a place of our refuge. Think about this. If you feel very close to somebody, whether innately like a parent or because you felt a close relationship like a friend, and you're struggling, going through a hard time, where do you want to be? You want to be with that person. They give you strength, right? Well, if I'm living my life this way, even if I'm not a totally godly person, but mainly, then I have a sense that what? That God is someone very real to me, someone I trust, someone I love, someone I respect. And I'm connected to God in the mitzvahs that I do. So when I feel like I need strength, when I feel like I need reinforcement, when I feel like I need to recoup, I don't take time off from my Torah mitzvahs. I find that strength in the Torah mitzvahs. And so that totally revolutionized everything. And what ends up happening is that rather than there is a person whose religion is Judaism, the person and their sense of God and their practice of Torah mitzvahs have, at least subjectively to themselves, become one thing. And that's what the first 25 chapters of Tanya are really about.
Wow.
Now, there is a problem, which I'm going to leave you with this problem, because that's why we have chapters 26 to 34. You cannot do this if you're in a bad mood. And so the Alter Rebbe devotes chapters 26 to 34, with 32 as an exception, we'll talk about it next week, as to, this is all very nice in theory, right? But I'm in a bad mood because I missed the bus. And now how do I deal with that? And all sorts of other types of issues. Or the analogy I like to use is, very nice that you have a amazing car, but it won't work without gas. And that's going to have to be next week.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaufmann.
Sorry, excuse me.
If anyone wants to ask a question, I can do this. You don't want?
So I'm going to thank everyone for coming. Same place, same time next week. We're doing 4 parts, and it's week after week, so you're more than welcome to join. We're very much here. It's a very auspicious day. The 13th of Chassidus just started, and so the idea is to really be proud Jews and these just like gems of Torah, to go out there and really spread light. So we hope that even if you understood a tiny, tiny bit, we know in Chassidus, it's like the healing power is immense. So we're very grateful to Rabbi Kaufmann. I think we should give her a round of applause. I hope I see you all next week. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.